And you know what? Yeah. All right. The Rules Committee will come to order. And today we are here to heed the call of countless veterans. They have pled with Congress and the Department of Defense for a very long time to cover the cost of health care impacts of their exposure to environmental hazards during their service. That includes things like water contaminated with toxic forever chemicals, airborne hazards from burn pits, and radiation from atomic testing and cleanups. This exposure contributed to the deaths of many, many veterans. Many more today are dealing with things like cancer and infertility, and many more still find themselves too sick to even work. These veterans sacrifice so much for our country, and the idea that they find themselves now fighting their country just to get disability claims approved is indefensible to me. And that's why we're considering H.R. 3967 today. The Honoring Our PACT Act is a comprehensive bill. It addresses the full gamut of issues impacting toxic exposed veterans' access to earned benefits and care. It cuts the red tape, streamlines the VA's review process, and removes the burden veterans face today to prove their own exposure to these toxins. Our nation has spent trillions and trillions of dollars over the last 20 years sending our service members to fight abroad. We should not nickel and dime their health care once they return home. Covering the check for toxic exposed veterans is a cost of war, and it's past time that we stepped up to foot the bill. And before I turn to our ranking member, I'd just like to take a moment to recognize Jeff Goringer, who's our incredible communications director. And he's behind me now. He's there. You know, for the last 6 years, beginning with former Chairwoman Louise Slaughter, who I know is watching over us today, Jeff has been a familiar face to many of us, not only in the Rules Committee, but all around the Capitol. And this is actually Jeff's second stint on Capitol Hill after working for South Dakota Senator Tim Johnson for 6 years. Behind the scenes, he has worked tirelessly to explain to people what's going on up here. And I think all of us know how challenging that task can sometimes be. He's been an invaluable member of my team, making sure that I always sound like I know exactly what I'm talking about, which is not an easy task. And I know many of you think that my eloquence comes naturally, but it comes as a surprise to you to know that sometimes it's pre-scripted. But today is Jeff's last Rules Committee meeting, and he is heading to an exciting new opportunity. And I think I speak not just for myself, but for members and staff on both sides of the aisle when I say to Jeff that we are grateful for your years of service to this institution. We wish you nothing but the best in all your future endeavors, and you will always be welcome here in the Rules Committee, and you will always be part of our kind of sometimes dysfunctional family. But we're going to miss you a lot, and we want to say thank you. And with that, I'm happy to yield to the ranking member.
You know, I think of Chairman McGovern and myself as being really nice guys, but we're shedding staff today. So maybe we're not as nice as you and I both know that we truly are. But I have a similar announcement to make. We are losing James Fitzella, who's been a member of the Republican staff in both the majority and minority for 7 years, has risen from staff assistant to a very senior member of our team, but he too is seeing opportunities elsewhere and has done an unbelievable job for us. You know, when I came here not expecting to have the position of ranking member, came pretty suddenly and a little bit late. So I am particularly grateful to the member of our former Chairman Sessions staff, on our side that stayed on, and Jim was one of those guys that stayed on and helped me get started and helped keep our ship in order as we tried to move ahead. And while we sometimes fight up here, is that we all know we work together quite a bit to try and expedite things. And I think Jimmy is one of the great institutionalists here that we both have, and both these staff people that we're losing today fit that role extraordinarily well. So this too is his last rules meeting, and as we say goodbye to Jeff, we also want to say goodbye to Jim, and don't be strangers. Fortunately, Jim knows where the cigars and the liquor are in the minority office, so we expect to see him frequently, and but we're going to miss him, and I appreciate very much the job that he's done. I would ask you to recognize him as well for his wonderful work on this committee.
Absolutely. You know, and I want to also congratulate Jim on his service here in the Rules Committee to this institution. And sometimes people don't realize that sometimes we have these kind of intense discussions here in the Rules Committee. But on a staff level, I mean, and even on a member level, I mean, we all get along pretty well. And I admire, just as I admire the majority staff, I have great admiration for the minority staff. And these people up here work long hours, longer than most people could possibly know, more than most members know. Even when we're gone, they're still working. And so we are grateful to them, and we will miss them. But again, we're always welcome here. And you know, now that we can take our masks off and we're getting back together, you know, maybe it's time to have a party. So to celebrate,
you know, you're always welcome downstairs, Mr. Chairman.
But anyway, having, and you want to, I think you want to.
Yeah, I want to make an opening statement, if I may.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Our hearing today, Mr. Chairman, as you know, covers a single item, H.R. 3976, the Honoring Our PAC Act. H.R. 3976 is intended to help toxic-exposed veterans get the health care they need and deserve. And this has been a longstanding problem that both Republicans and Democrats are committed to addressing. Unfortunately, today's bill, in our opinion, misses the mark. Like almost every major bill proposed by the current Democratic majority, they once again propose to throw enormous sums of money at a problem. But simply spending money on the issue of this magnitude is not a realistic solution. Indeed, it's unclear whether or not the Department of Veterans Affairs can even implement this proposed bill without overwhelming the current VA healthcare system, particularly in rural districts like my own. If enacted into law, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that this bill would cost almost $300 billion over the next 10-year budget window. Spending this much money without knowing whether or not the VA can even do what we would be asking them to do, I think is a recipe for failure, while also increasing the subsequent debt burden to America's children and grandchildren. By contrast, 2 weeks ago, by unanimous consent, the Senate passed S. 3541, which would expand eligibility for veterans exposed to toxic substances. If the House were to instead take up that legislation, we could get it to the President's desk literally this week to be signed into law and deliver immediate help to our veterans. This is a measured and reasonable solution that would quickly result in needed health care services for American veterans and accomplish the first step in a three-phase approach to address toxic exposure in our military in a comprehensive way. I look forward to hearing the discussion from our witnesses today, particularly on the alternative bill. But before I yield back, again, I'd like to take this opportunity to address the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. Last Thursday, Mr. Chairman, at the behest of Vladimir Putin, the Russian armed forces launched an unprovoked and illegitimate invasion of Ukraine. This action is eerily similar to what the world witnessed in Europe almost a century ago. In the 1930s, the world was slow to react to unprovoked and naked aggression. We must not make that same mistake today, and so far I don't believe we have. By now, it should be abundantly clear to the world who Vladimir Putin really is. He's a tyrant, a bully, and a thug who's bent on bringing a neighboring democratic country into his orbit by force. For 20 years, American policymakers from both parties and across multiple administrations have made a pattern of underestimating and ignoring Vladimir Putin and his odious acts. But today, surely we all see him and his regime for who and what they are. Mr. Putin has chosen to violate the peace in Europe that has lasted for more than 75 years. If he succeeds in dismantling Ukraine or in placing his own puppet government there, he and others of his ilk will be tempted and emboldened to repeat this kind of aggression against their innocent and weaker neighbors. This action calls for a resolute, bipartisan response from the United States and our allies. It calls for a response that supports the people and the democratically elected government of Ukraine. It calls for a response that discourages and deters further aggression, and one that punishes Vladimir Putin, his cronies, and his government for this egregious violation of the norms of civilized behavior and of international law. I look forward to working with my colleagues and with the President of the United States to support the freedom-loving people of Ukraine as they defend their homeland against Russian aggression. And I'm sure we'll hear something about that tomorrow night, which I suspect the world will be listening to with a great deal of interest. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I yield back.
Well, I want to thank the gentleman. Let me just say for the record that I want to associate myself with his remarks on the Ukraine. I think we are all horrified by what has unfolded here. You know, I co-chair the Human Rights Commission. I've done many hearings on the human rights situation in Russia and on Putin's brutality and his total disregard for the basic human rights of his own people. You disagree with him, he throws you in jail, you're tortured, or you're killed. His invasion of Ukraine was totally unprovoked. There is no basis for it. And I think that we all can agree that he's not smart and he's not a genius, but he's a bully. And the only thing bullies understand is standing up to them. And I hope that there is strong, I hope there is strong bipartisan support for standing up to Putin, because I think the gentleman is right that if we don't, then this doesn't bode well for the future. Not only with regard to Russia's adventurism, but if you're President Xi watching this, you're wondering whether or not, you know, if he can get away with it, let me take over Taiwan. So there's a lot at stake here, but I think we also could all agree how inspired we are by the Ukrainian people. I mean, I have read countless stories about the bravery of not just the president of Ukraine and not just the military of Ukraine, but grandmothers and average people who are standing up to this gigantic force, Russian force, and saying, no, we're not going to just give in. We're not going to allow you to do this. It really is. I think the whole world is inspired by what we're seeing, and so the people of Ukraine are in our prayers. Let's hope there's a off-ramp here for Putin, that he decides to. Maybe the oligarchs will get to him and tell him, stop it, and he'll rethink this. But this is a human rights atrocity, and I'm glad that the world is coming together. So, thank you for that. At this point, I would like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on H.R. 3967, the Honoring Our Pact Act of 2021. We will begin with the chairman of the committee, Chairman Takano.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern. I, too, would like to associate myself with the remarks of the ranking member insofar as they addressed Ukraine, not so insofar as they addressed the Honoring Our Pact Act. It is my hope that we will see arise from this moment the old ethos of foreign policy differences end at the water's edge, and that we as Republicans and Democrats together, as freedom-loving citizens, truly do recognize the dastardliness of an autocrat. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm here today in support of the Honoring Our Pact Act of 2021. As chairman of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, I've heard from countless veterans across this country who, without hesitation after 9/11, raised their right hand to protect and defend this nation and are now sick as a result of that service. We made a pact with these individuals, a pact I'm afraid to say that we have not yet honored. The legislation before this committee today will help fix that. Unlike other pieces of legislation in this space, the PACT Act offers a comprehensive solution. Now is the time for a sincere movement toward keeping our promise, not sincere gestures. First, the PACT Act will open up critical access to VA healthcare to more than 3.5 million veterans who were exposed to burn pits and other hazardous material in the line of duty. Second, it clearly establishes a presumption of service connection for over 23 respiratory illnesses and cancers. This is a key pillar of this legislation. Its passage into law is a clear recognition by this Congress and the American people that veterans were exposed to toxic substances and they are suffering because of it. The burden to prove toxic exposure should not be on our veterans, and we will no longer make veterans fight our government for this recognition. Access to culturally competent care is so critical for these veterans, and I'm sure all of you have heard harrowing stories from constituents who have struggled to receive access to the health care these unique conditions require. Third, this legislation will reform VA's presumptive decision-making process, a process that has long been criticized by key stakeholders for its lack of transparency and speed. The bill requires VA to establish a model that will have firm deadlines and a transparent and responsive process for identifying new illnesses and diseases positively associated with in-service toxic exposure without the need for congressional intervention. Critically, it will ensure that there is meaningful input from veterans and the scientific community throughout this process. Finally, this legislation also enhances VA's research on toxic exposures and its long-term effects. While it will have immediate impact on how veterans are treated for these conditions, as with VA's other research efforts, the broader public may see advances in medicine as a result, too. Unfortunately, I fear some in this room today will seek to dismiss this legislation. I will address some of those potential reasons, but none of these give me any pause or hesitation about the need to pass this legislation. I have no doubt that it is the right, the moral, and the patriotic thing to do. As to criticisms about cost, to those critics, I would say over the past 20 years, Congress has made the choice to spend trillions of dollars on war, conflicts that have ultimately caused many veterans irreparable harm. The true cost of war carries on for decades after the conflict ends. And for many toxic exposed veterans, they are still in the heat of battle today. A lesson we seem to fail to remember time and time again. Toxic exposed veterans have held up their part of the pact. Now it is our turn. Regarding criticisms about implementation, I know there are always concerns about the Department of Veterans Affairs' ability to implement new programs. This is true across the government. I lead a committee that is overseeing VA and demanding accountability every day. And there's no question that there is going to be more work for VA, more claims to process, more care to deliver, but that does not mean for 1 second that we don't move forward. As the House of Representatives, we can't just stand around and lament the issues. We must do something. We have the power to resource VA and ensure that it has what it needs to successfully implement this bill. I have worked with Chairwoman DeLauro to ensure that authorizers and appropriators are in this together. I cannot in good conscience meet with another veteran cut down in the prime of life by cancer or a respiratory illness and say, I'm sorry, you have to wait 40 years while Congress figures it out. I can't believe that any member of this House would abide that answer, and neither should we, our veterans. As to any criticisms about process, this bill has been through the full gamut. It was carefully considered in committee at a legislative hearing, marked up, and then in January of this year, the committee held a public roundtable to elicit even more feedback from stakeholders and my colleagues across the aisle. I've made every effort to listen to and address meaningful feedback. Last week, a broad coalition of 42 stakeholders submitted a letter to Speaker Pelosi and Minority Leader McCarthy calling for swift passage of the PACT Act, and I ask unanimous consent to enter their letter into the record.
Without objection.
In that letter, they acknowledge nothing less than the full PACT Act being considered on the floor would be unacceptable. They acknowledge that anything less, rather, than the full PACT Act being considered on the floor would be unacceptable. I could not agree with them more. It is very clear that our stakeholders, veterans and the Veteran Service Organizations Committee, want this bill to pass. Again, I wish to thank Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole for considering this legislation on the Rules Committee today, and I urge the rest of my colleagues to support this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, and we're happy to welcome Ranking Member Bost. And again, thank you for being here, and also thank you for sharing with us your connection to Ukraine, that you hosted an exchange student, and so it's very, very personal to you and your family.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to associate with yours and the ranking member's remarks on Ukraine. Anastasia is there. We're in constant communication with her. They're standing up against a tyrant. And I know there's people that have friends and family, and for free nations such as ours, the advantage of this today, we're sitting here and we're going to disagree on a bill. And guess what? We're going to walk out of here and still be friends, right? Nobody's going to take up arms. And it is such a shame to watch someone who we've watched treat people like he has in Putin. And I think even to the point that many of his own people, I don't believe, agree with him. So with that being said.
Anastasia and her family will be in our prayers.
Thank you. Thank you. Chairman and Ranking Member, for the second time this year, I'm testifying today in opposition to a veterans bill. And I'd prefer to be here in support of the legislation to help veterans. That I cannot do that today is a sad reflection on the partisanship and the partisan nature of the VA committee at this time under the Democrat majority. The PACT Act is a perfect example of that. I care deeply about veterans suffering from toxic exposures, and I know that Chairman Takano does too. But I would have to hope that we could work together on this. My staff reached out to the majority repeatedly and requested the opportunity to do just that. Those requests were denied. That's a shame, especially since the VA committee used to be the most bipartisan committee in Congress. Because we did not work together to resolve our differences, the PACT Act has serious flaws that prevent me from supporting it. Those flaws also threaten our ability to do anything meaningful this Congress for toxic exposure and toxic exposed veterans. The PACT Act would grant benefits for certain veterans with certain conditions with very little, if any, scientific basis while telling other veterans to wait for research. That would create a fundamental unfairness between the veterans with similar services and exposure history. And again, Democrats are proposing to do it without scientific consensus. The PACT Act would also flood VA with so many new mandates that the veterans already receiving care benefits would possibly have to wait longer. Veterans wait too long for their doctor's appointments and disability checks as it is. Making them wait longer would spell disaster for them. The PACT Act would also spell disaster for taxpayers. The bill was changed significantly less than 2 weeks ago, and the majority rejected my efforts to discuss these changes. Just an hour ago, CBO provided an update cost estimate on the bill. 1 hour ago. It costs more than $300 billion in new mandatory and discretionary offsets. There are some who would say that this is just the cost of war. I'm a veteran from a military family. My grandfather and my father fought in Korea. My uncle in Vietnam, where he was the victim of the ultimate oxymoron, friendly fire, and survives today with his veterans benefits. My son and my grandson currently serve. I know what war costs. I also know that veterans pay taxes too. Like many others in this country, thanks to the Biden economy, veterans are struggling to make ends meet. And they're also paying more everywhere from grocery stores to the gas pump right now. We are not doing right by them by failing to be fiscally responsible on their behalf. I have offered an amendment to replace the PAC Act with the Health Care for Burnt Pit Veterans Act. The Health Care for Burnt Pit Veterans Act would let toxic exposed post 9/11 combat veterans get VA care. It is bipartisan, and it has already passed the Senate. Every day that the House fails to send it to the President is another day that a sick veteran doesn't get care that they need. Nothing could be more unacceptable. I hope my amendment will be made in order. It is the right first step to toxic exposed veterans and getting them the care they need now. And it will buy us time to work on a bipartisan, bicameral basis to deliver other benefits and services to toxic exposed veterans, which we should have done all Congress and haven't even started to do yet. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, and I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank you both. I should just say for the record that I've been contacted by virtually every veterans organization in the country who is in support of this legislation, and so I too will support it. I will yield to the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank both our witnesses for being here. Recalling the last time the Veterans Committee came before the Rules Committee for a rule vote earlier this year, I made the point that I was disappointed to see those bills come up outside of regular order, and it's unfortunate to some degree this process is playing out. In this case, I am glad to say that the base bill did undergo hearings and a markup, but it's unfortunate to see parts of this legislation did not go through a markup and frankly are outside the jurisdiction of the Veterans Committee. And those have been airdropped into the bill before us today through the Rules Committee print. Given that background, Mr. Bost, can I ask you, would you please expand on discussions you may have had with the committee, with the chairman, leading to this process? Were you or any of your colleagues consulted about the changes we now see in the Rules Committee print? And do you have any concerns as to how this is playing out?
Yeah, thank you for that question. You know, there is not a bipartisan thing about this with the majority, with this particular bill. The majority has constantly refused to meaningful communicate with us on this bill, even to the point where staff reached out, even though I talked to the chairman, I thought we were going to do that, and then the staff later came back and said no. And we didn't see the revised text, and it wasn't published by the Rules Committee. My staff was willing to work through these concerns with the majority line by line, but they rebuffed any opportunity to do that. My staff also told that any proposed changes to the scope of the bill would not be accepted. Section 706 of the bill comes from H.R. 6482, which was referred to the Judiciary Committee, not the VA Committee. It is under their jurisdiction and should not be under the VA's jurisdiction. But it would allow veterans to sue the United States for a disability incurred in military service and has not gone through regular order in Congress. This type of change should not simply be airdropped without careful consideration when we're talking about changing laws in the way that Congress has always felt when somebody is going to deal with a veteran situation.
Okay, there's no doubt that Congress needs to play its part to ensure that veterans impacted by burn pit toxins are provided with the care that they deserve. I think there's actually bipartisan agreement on that, and parts of this bill represent that. But concerns have been raised about the ability of the VA centers, especially in rural areas that are already underserved and overstressed, to manage the influx of new patients while still providing continued quality care and services. So, Mr. Bost, could you please expand on any conversations you had in that regard? That is about the capacity of the VA to actually handle this workload.
Well, we have zero assurance that the VA and the PACT Act can be implemented without disrupting services to existing veterans, to veterans who are receiving care right now. I hear every day from veterans who cannot get care in a timely manner in the VA right now. The PACT Act would make millions more veterans eligible for care through the same system, much more than the Health Care for Burnt Pit Veterans Act would. Of course, that will have implementation process situations as well, but we are more likely to be able to implement those. This will lead to longer wait times for veterans. It'll put a strain on the VA resources and personnel. Even VA's own providers have expressed concerns about the impact and influx of new patients without accommodations and resources will have clogging up the already overburdened system. The VA also estimates that the PACT Act will cause an unprecedented backlog of over 1.5 million disability claims. An increase in claims decisions is likely to result in an increase in appeals, which will add to the appeals backlog. All veterans may be forced to wait months or years for a final decision on their disability claim or appeals, which we just corrected in the laws that we passed over the last 3 or 4 years to try to reduce that. And this could kick us right back into that situation. And the sad reality is that it is, we will hurt other veterans with this.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I want to, without objection, I want to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a statement of administration policy in support of H.R. 3967. Without objection, I'm going to now turn to Mrs. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm very pleased to speak in favor of the honoring our PACT Act today. You know, as a mother of an Air Force veteran, I urge my colleagues, all of them, to support this long-awaited comprehensive legislation. Ensuring that our service members are taken care of and receive the best health care and benefits that the VA can offer is a priority, not just for me, but for many of my colleagues, both Republican and Democrats. I know that. Especially since our government sends our children, our neighbors, our friends to war and exposes them to hazards from burn pits, PFAS, radiation, toxic exposures, and have caused cancers, infertility, which is an issue that we're dealing with in our family, respiratory conditions, unexplained chronic illnesses. Burn pits have exposed as many as 3.5 million service members to dangerous fumes. The cost of war is not just military equipment. It's not. It is the precious lives of our sons and daughters. And ours is a volunteer military. And when we send recruiters out, and you know, I go out there myself to high schools and recruit for our military academies. Great candidates, by the way. And if they're good enough to be recruited into our military and to be sent out to fight and support democracies at home and abroad, then they have to be good enough to be taken care of when they're sick, when they're trying to have a baby and can't. You know, we make a promise to our veterans that when they return from defending our democracy, that we will take care of them. Money is important, but their precious lives should be, more value than the weapons that we arm them with. With this legislation, we will take a big step towards fulfilling that promise that we make to our sons and daughters. And I'm very happy that two of my amendments, thank you, Mr. Chairman, that my amendments were adopted. One helps veterans receive health care and benefits information in the language of their choice. And it's not about a veteran not being able to understand English. It is about their caretaker that may not be able to be fluent in English. The other directs the VA to study how best to provide early detection cancer testing to our veterans so that cancers are detected as early as possible. And we can achieve the best outcomes possible for our veterans. Our nation's heroes deserve to have access to health care and benefits, which they urgently need. They don't just deserve to have a weapon. They don't just deserve to have orders to defend our country. If the cost of war is added up in dollars and cents by the cost of taking care of them and providing for their health care, then I think that we need to revisit that. And once again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for accepting my amendments. Thank you, Chairman Takano, for your commitment to our veterans. And thank you, Ranking Member, for your commitment also to our veterans. And I yield back.
Thank you very much. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to our witnesses for being here today. In the interest of time, let me associate myself with the remarks of our ranking member, both as to the legislation that's the subject of the rule today, as well as his remarks on the suffering of the people in Ukraine. It is startling to see the pictures and the images that have come across the television screens and social media in the past 72 hours. I do expect that we will hear a great deal more in the classified briefing that is scheduled for this afternoon, but I put me in the camp of every economic sanction that can be applied against this monster needs to happen. In fact, should have happened last week. I know there are other things that could be done. We don't need to be following Germany on this. We need to be leading. So it is with a great deal of concern that I'm seeing the events that are happening in the world today. I will just say I'm not surprised by the resistance and the determination of the people of Ukraine. 2014, I had an opportunity to be there as an election monitor with the Helsinki Commission. This was just a few weeks after they had deposed Viktor Yanukovych and sent him back to Moscow. And the people literally rose up on their own and fought the police and what were probably then Russian soldiers with bricks and handmade shields. It was truly remarkable that they were able to be as effective as they were, and in fact victorious in that, which gave us the election of President Poroshenko and subsequently the election of President Zelensky. And President Zelensky has certainly distinguished himself as a true leader among his people, and we need to be prepared to provide all of the economic firepower we can against that evil monster in Russia. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burgess, for your powerful words. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to, first of all, associate myself with remarks made about our staff who are leaving. I think the staff do amazing work here and often go unnoticed and unrewarded, and just want to add my thanks to them and everyone who supports our work. Secondly, I'd like to additionally associate myself with the remarks made by the chair and the ranking member. Rochester, New York is home to the third largest Ukrainian American community in the United States. And I spent many hours this Saturday, as I have spent previous Saturdays, communicating with them about this crisis. And the one thing that I think has happened which has been gravely underestimated by the person that others have referred to appropriately as a thug and a thief and probably a killer, and certainly someone who is engaged in war crimes, President Putin, is that he has clearly underestimated the will of the Ukrainian people and the resistance. I think he's underestimated the resolve of the West and NATO allies and partners and how they will defend the interests of democratic, loving people around the world. And I think he's underestimated the Russian people, who clearly are beginning to demonstrate their intolerance for what they see as violence against literally their brothers and cousins and sisters and people that they associate with. So I believe this will not end well for Mr. Putin. It shouldn't end well, and I think I stand with all of you and appreciate the comments made about the situation, which is very grave in Central and Eastern Europe. And finally, I'd like to thank Chairman Takano and the members of the committee and the ranking member for being here. I have strongly supported efforts to make sure burn pits and exposure to toxic substances that our veterans have had to endure do not go uncompensated, unrecognized. And just want to thank him for bringing this. We've continued to work on veterans legislation in the last few weeks. I think that's a testament to the members of that committee for their continued efforts, and I will support the rule and the underlying legislation. I want to thank you, and I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to just extend a congratulations to Jeff. I'm not sure where Jeff went, but James, I know we'll be seeing each other. So, but okay. Oh, yeah, that's right. I'm sorry. I saw it. James was sitting right there. I told him I'm sorry about that. They left. Well, I tried to extend them well wishes. I associate my remarks with the chairman, of course. I'm sorry, the ranking member. But Mr. Chairman, there's one thing you said that I totally agree with, and that's that we need a party. I'm in whenever.
Was that it? I thought I said more.
He let that guy.
I can't just associate remarks with everything, but with that, you got me. You had me a party. All right, with that, thanks to the chairman and the ranking member for working on this. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, and I neglected to notice Mr. Raskin, so I want to yield to Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Also, I'd like to add my voice to the chorus of praise for our staff and also associate myself with your remarks and those of the ranking member about the outrage and atrocity being committed in Ukraine by Vladimir Putin. He is a thug. He is a war criminal. He is an international pariah at this point. As you say, he's not a genius. As one of our former presidents said, he is not savvy and smart, but he is an international outlaw and must be treated that way. And we must do everything we can to mobilize the democratic governments and movements and peoples of the world to isolate him, to defend the Ukrainian democracy against this outrageous act of authoritarianism and imperialism by a guy who is convinced he's going to somehow rebuild the Russian Empire today. I'd like to thank Chairman Takano for his work on.
Hey, Jamie, if you have, you know what, if you could suspend, because we're having a little audio problem here.
Okay.
So we're not hearing you as clear, so we're going to fix that, okay? We'll come back to you, okay?
Very good.
All right, we'll come back to you. All right,
Sounds good.
okay, all right. Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I guess I just have, one kind of maybe ranking member would like to discuss a little more. I know that ranking member Cole asked, about kind of the overwhelming numbers that will be coming in and what the effect it would have on the VA system. Well, I'm in a rural area. And there's a lot of rural areas, and there's contracted clinics and things like that. And I'm wondering if you have some idea of how that will be dealt with this increase.
Right, and it's not only what the influx will be as far as the hospital side, but also for the benefits side. And the concern we have is that right now, especially after COVID, we're overwhelmed. We have already had a lot of discussion on increasing to try to keep nurses and doctors in place. We had that conversation with, and actually marked up a bill a few weeks ago on that. The concerns we have there to automatically throw people on. Now, let me also explain to you that the other bill that is bipartisan, bicameral, that we're working on is actually provides the healthcare side. So we believe that we can do that and provide the healthcare side if we make sure we provide the revenues necessary to beef up staff, make sure staff stays for those that we've lost during the pandemic. So we have to work together to try to achieve that. But if the other concerns we have is the claims that are disability claims that are going to increase to as much as 1.5 million. And then you've got to try to see how long and how slowed down that process will be. So the people that are receiving benefits now could be, yes, in time they would receive, but the question is how much time, how much staffing, and none of that's been discussed yet.
And Ranking Member, was there any discussion about, those contracting health systems, that where people are getting, getting their health care?
Actually, there's been very little discussion on the overall impact on them as the process has moved through from one side and one side only.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Raskin, so apparently your voice is coming across really well on camera, but not in the room. So if you have a question, you're going to have to really scream it.
All right. I have just one question for Mr. Takano, because we know our veterans have been exposed to nuclear radiation. They've been exposed to toxic burn pits, PFAS, and so on. Can you explain how the current disability grievance and compensation process has been failing our veterans?
Well, the current compensation, the comp and pen process, has been very frustrating to our veterans. Veterans often feel, and it's not just they feel it, it is the fact that they are fighting our government, that the burden of proof is on them. They have to, out of pocket, spend thousands of dollars, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars to plead their case to the government for why their condition should be recognized and why they should get access to medical care. This bill, what we try to do in the Honorary Pact Act is make a fundamental shift. Instead of placing the burden of proof on our veterans, we believe that we should give them the benefit of the doubt. And that does not mean anything goes. That does not mean that anything goes. But we do in this bill reform the process by which presumptions are established. We give the Secretary of the VA a set time in which to set up that process, and a set time by which he also, or he has to also implement that process. And the process must include prior input from veterans themselves. Veterans need to be on the front end of the process of how a presumption gets recommended. And we also allow a more permissive bar by which a presumption may be eligible. Instead of it having to be an absolute causal relationship between the exposure and a medical condition, we say there has to be some positive association. Now, that doesn't mean that the Secretary must accept that level of association, but we allow that recommendation to come on the front end so that a presumption, an illness, a type of illness can actually get on the agenda and considered. We've learned from the Vietnam War veteran experience just how long science takes. The science may take decades while veterans are dying, and they have died of conditions related to Agent Orange. Sometimes there's an element of common sense and an element of judgment. And that's what we try to give the discretion to the secretary. But that discretion can also turn into maddening delays from the perspective of the veteran and from the perspective of a common sense citizen. You know, even when we've had ample evidence from the Academy of Sciences, the Academy of Sciences recommended 3 conditions to Secretary Shulkin at the beginning of the Trump administration about illnesses related to Agent Orange. We're talking about the Vietnam War era veterans. There was very, very credible evidence presented by the Academy of Sciences. And Secretary Shulkin, I believe, was inclined to recommend that these illnesses be fully accepted as presumptions, but the process got stopped at the Office of Management Budget at the White House under Mick Mulvaney. And veterans were beginning to think, that was another example, it was another example to our veterans, that it was politics and economics and not science that was ruling the day. We set forward a reform of the presumption process in this bill. And we also say 23 illnesses are close enough that we can declare 23 illnesses in this bill. And going forward, we need to have a reformed presumption establishing process. Again, Congressman Raskin, the current process is frustrating, it seems unfair, and it seems to allow for a lot of politics and economics to trump, justice for our veterans.
Well, I just want to thank you for that. This is a long overdue change. Our veterans in service of our country have been exposed to these toxic pits where they're burning paint and chemicals and jet fuel and medical and human waste and so on. They've been exposed to radiation. And then when they come back with cancer, somehow they're expected to prove on a one-to-one basis that they contracted their disease in the military as opposed to somewhere else. And you're basically trying to prove a negative. And that's a pretty nasty thing to do to people who step forward to serve their country. So I thank you for shifting this presumption. I think it's something we should all get behind. I can't imagine why anybody would not be for this. And I thank you for your hard work, and I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This bill feels like a natural successor to the Blue Water Navy Vietnam Veterans Act that we passed in 2019. And that was a bill that had been on my radar since even before I came to Congress. We had an advocate in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, a guy named John Burry, who had served in Vietnam, was one of these Navy veterans who contracted cancer and other Agent Orange-related diseases. And back in 2010, 2011, 2012, he was advocating for this. At that time, the former holder of my seat was Navy Admiral Joe Sestak. And so he took up the cause there. So it was really, really gratifying that even though John Burry didn't make it until we passed that legislation in 2019, it was good to see that acknowledgement, that flipping of the burden of proof, the presumption that people who had served under certain circumstances, if they got these diseases, would be covered with VA benefits. So I see this bill as a very natural successor. And as someone who's represented veterans trying to get the benefits they're owed, it's so important to flip that presumption. I mean, one of the pieces of the Build Back Better bill that has not passed yet, and a piece that has to do with necessary infrastructure, has to do with funding of our VA facilities and digitizing veterans' records, because they're all over the country and they're not digitized, and forcing veterans to prove that they were in a particular place and got a particular disease because of that, it's just not fair. And how we can have that lack of fairness for people who have served our country it's not right, and we can't let that go on. So I'm very, very pleased about this bill. I was interested in reading that The presumption process will help in situations, even going back as far as Agent Orange cases in the Vietnam War, because of this time lag in creating presumptions. And I was reading in the notes that there was a 2016 study that related hypertension to Agent Orange, and is that this bill will finally have hypertension being recognized? Is that right, Mr. Takano?
I'm not sure that the bill, I think that's right with the bill.
Creates a process, so it will-
I actually believe that hypertension's already being considered by the secretary.
Okay.
And the secretary has moved forward with rulemaking on hypertension.
Okay.
So yes, and I do believe the bill does cover it, yes.
Okay, well, I appreciate it, and we have so many veterans in Pennsylvania, and we want to make it easier for them to get the benefits they're owed. The other issue that we hear from constituents, our younger veterans, about a lot is burn pits. Can you just summarize how this bill will address the burn pit toxin issues?
Well, thank you for that question. The first thing it does, the monumental thing it does, is it says if you served near burn pits, so based on your location and the time you served, we'll concede exposure. There's a concession of exposure, and with that concession of exposure, you're entitled to VA healthcare benefits. That's 3.5 million veterans that are estimated to have been exposed that will have access to medical care. The next thing that it does is, as I said in quite detail in my response to Mr. Raskin's question, we reform the process by which presumptive illnesses are determined. And then finally, we declare 23 presumptive illnesses, illnesses that that are very reasonably connected to something that's the respiratory effects of being exposed to burn pits. I think it's important for Americans and all the committee to be reminded that the burn pits, the toxic effects of these burn pits would be abhorrent to every American in this country. There is not a community in our country that would permit this, the creation of a burn pit such as the ones that our service members were obligated to be around and be exposed to every day. No state, no county, no city, no rural area would allow a burn pit of the size and magnitude that we saw and the types of things that could be burned in these burn pits there was no accountability. The DOD does not have to knuckle under OSHA, occupational safety, so look, we have subjected our service members to something that they would never, ever have to undergo on a daily basis here in any community in our country. And, we can reasonably come together on what sorts of illnesses that are showing up and presenting themselves should be considered eligible for some sort of compensation if they're debilitating. The other thing I would say is that our burn pit, people who've suffered in the burn pits, suffered from burn pit exposure, they no longer need to be fighting our government. They need to be having the support of our government, the support of all the rest of us. And now is the time for us to not let what happened to our Vietnam veterans, the real, why the Honorary Pact Act is truly a successor to the Blue Water Navy Vietnam Veterans Act, is that Blue Water, as great as it was 40 years too late. It took 40 years to get justice to our naval service members who served on surface ships on the territorial waters of Vietnam. We do not want to see 40 years to elapse, and then we do justice to our Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. And if there's any promise and any lesson of history we can learn in this space, is let us not repeat what we did to the Vietnam veteran, to this generation of veterans. Let us do right by these veterans now.
Thank you, and that speaks to John Burry from my neck of the woods, who advocated for all of his veteran colleagues and never lived to see the results. So we do appreciate that. I also appreciate, I have a sister who served in the Army, and we do not get to have a conversation or a family dinner without her bringing up the need to address this issue. So I appreciate your action on this, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Ross?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I see Mr. Desagne is on, he's not going to, okay, thank you. I also want to associate myself with the comments of the ranking member of the Rules Committee about Ukraine, and am extremely heartened to see our international partners, including partners who have previously remained neutral, taking up with not only NATO, but the rest of the world in condemning Mr. Putin, in condemning this aggression, and in supporting the people of Ukraine. And I hope that we have even more opportunities to do that in this body this week and in the coming weeks. And with that, I also want to thank you, Chair Takano, for bringing this bill forward. Justice delayed is justice denied, particularly for people who have served their country. And as a nation, we have a responsibility to honor and protect our veterans. My dad was a doctor in the Air Force during Vietnam. He was a psychiatrist in the Air Force during Vietnam, and saw not only the physical injuries, but the emotional injuries that people didn't even believe in things like PTSD back then. And so we have got to take care of our veterans, even for past transgressions. Thousands of men and women who served in our armed forces are living with these consequences and living with the consequences of toxic exposure that occurred during their deployments and during their training. When service members are exposed to hazardous substances in the line of duty, we have an obligation to provide them with resources and support, including health care, to enable them to live lives of dignity. That's why I'm a proud co-sponsor of the Camp Lejeune Justice Act, which is included in this legislation, and it provides our service members an opportunity to seek compensation for exposure to contaminated water at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. And Senator Tillis is the primary mover of this on the Senate side, so it is bipartisan. For decades, Marines at Camp Lejeune and their families have drank, bathed, and used water containing toxic compounds. This exposure is linked to various forms of cancer and other health risks, which many service members continue to battle this day. Unfortunately, North Carolina law has prevented these veterans from seeking relief in court, and the Camp Lejeune Justice Act will correct this injustice. Far too many veterans, their family members, and others have suffered from the debilitating and deadly diseases resulting from their exposure at Camp Lejeune. This bill is a step toward justice and accountability. I also want to highlight a provision in this bill that creates a registry of individuals exposed to PFAS from aqueous film-forming foam on military installations. I've proposed an amendment to this section that will require the Department of Defense to study additional causes of PFAS exposure on military bases in order to ensure that all sources of contamination are properly examined. And my colleague from North Carolina, Representative Rouser, has joined me in putting this amendment forward. Congress has a duty to advocate on behalf of service members, veterans, and their families to ensure we fulfill our promise to them as a country and provide them with the care and the recognition they deserve. I support the underlying bill and the rule, and thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I know Mr. Raskin has asked me to yield to him once again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm seeking unanimous consent to submit to the record our colleague Sheila Jackson-Lee's statement in support of her amendment to this legislation.
Without objection. Does any other member of the committee wish to be recognized? If not, I want to thank both our witnesses for being here, and you can go. Thank you. Are there any other members who wish to testify in H.R. 3967? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on H.R. 3967. At this point, the committee is going to stand in recess because we still have a few things that we have to work out, I guess. And so I'm hoping that we could get them done before we have the briefing. That's my hope, but we will get back to you as soon as we hear anything new. So with that, we will, without objection, the committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair. We're going to try to reconvene as soon as possible. It might be 20 or 30 minutes, but I will check with you. Yeah, you got it, yeah, all right. All right.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee report a structure rule for consideration of H.R. 3967, the Honoring Our Pact Act of 2021. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate on the bill, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Veterans Affairs. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of text of Rules Committee Print 117-33, modified by the amendment printed in Part A of Rules Committee Report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides that following debate, each further amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee Report not earlier considered as part of amendments and block pursuant to Section 3 shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and opponent, may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before the question is put thereon, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. Section 3 of the rule provides that at any time after debate, the chair of the Committee on Veterans Affairs or his designee may offer amendments en bloc consisting of further amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee Report, not earlier disposed of. Amendments en bloc shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Veterans Affairs of the or their designees, shall not be subject to amendment and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the report and amendments en bloc described in Section 3 of the resolution. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit.
Thank you very much. You've heard the motion from the gentleman from California. Is there any amendment or discussion? Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, thank you for making a number of our amendments in order. Appreciate that. Of course, we have some other options you might want to consider. So, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. My amendment would eliminate all the unprecedented pandemic authorities granted to the Speaker. Mr. Chairman, it's been almost 2 years since Democrats implemented the unprecedented restrictions on the form and function of the House of Representatives. On some of these, I think people could have agreed, and at least for the usage of on a temporary basis. However, that time is gone now. On Friday, the CDC issued new guidance regarding the use of masks, placing the District of Columbia in the low-risk community level. Last night, the attending physician rescinded guidance that makes masks required indoors and stated that, quote, the case rate at the Capitol is among the lowest in the nation, and all across the country, schools that once had mask mandates are removing them. It's time for the House of Representatives to begin operating like normal again. That means no more proxy voting, no more martial law, no more blanket adjournment authority, and no more of the Pelosi lockdown that has shackled the House and changed the institution, and in my view, not for the better. We've got 3 vaccines available, booster shots and other therapeutics that are both safe and effective at dealing with the COVID symptoms for everyone 5 and older. Time to restore the House as an institution and empower all our members. I urge the adoption and yield back.
Thank you very much. You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. No.
On that, I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess?
Aye.
Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler?
Aye.
Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Matter is not agreed to. Further amendments.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. My amendment would eliminate the martial law authorities granted to the Speaker Mr. Chairman, if Democrats are unwilling to eliminate all the unprecedented restrictions in the House, I'm hopeful that you would at least agree that some of the pandemic restrictions could be eliminated. The Rules Committee doesn't need the ability to bring rules to the floor immediately. The Speaker shouldn't have unilateral authority or adjournment authority. Members should once again be able to vote on approval of the journal. Certainly the ongoing combat operations in and around Ukraine, the War Powers Resolution shouldn't be turned off. Even though the Speaker has finally agreed that the mask mandate can be rescinded, we can and should do more than just that gesture. As counties and municipalities are opening up all across the country, the House should, as an example.
Could somebody, could the people on the, who are operating remotely put their voice on mute so we're getting some feedback? I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As counties and municipalities are opening up all across the country, the House should stand as an example and return to the way we've always operated as an institution, not holding on to martial law authorities so the Speaker can bend her narrow majority to her will. I urge adoption and yield back.
Heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Cole Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The chair noes have it.
And that I request recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Rushenthaler? Aye. Mr. Rushenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments. Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee add language in the rule that stops the tolling of days for resolutions of inquiry. Mr. Chairman, I want to start off with a list. President Trump's zero tolerance policy, President Trump's use of pardon power, the 2020 census, the Antiquities Act, FBI Director Comey, and Russia. All of these topics were subjects of resolutions of inquiry filed by Democrats in the 115th Congress, when, I might add, we were in the majority. Was it inconvenient for the committee chairman to have to mark up those resolutions? Most assuredly. However, what Republicans understood was that this is the fundamental and legitimate oversight power of Congress. Unfortunately, what the Speaker has done is use COVID as an excuse to shield the Biden administration from real questions and protect Democrats from having to take inconvenient votes. That's what we've been sent here to do, Mr. Chairman, take votes and make our positions known to our constituents. Mr. Chairman, sometimes tough questions need to be asked, and to ensure the power of oversight can be conducted in continuing silence, not only the minority, but frankly, all members of Congress of this body. That does an extreme disservice to this institution. I urge the adoption and yield back.
Yeah. I thank the gentleman for his amendment. I just want to point out for the record that, you know, the resolution of inquiry was shut off when Trump was president. So the idea that it was there to protect Biden is not the case. I'll just say this. I think, you know, we're hoping to do a hearing in the Rules Committee in the not-too-distant future to talk about a whole range of things that were put in place during the pandemic, including how committees operate, how we vote, and I think everything will be on the table. But you know, it'd be a lot easier if your leadership would, if they're serious about investigations, would actually take investigations seriously. It might go a long way if Minority Leader McCarthy himself and others would agree to cooperate with the January 6th inquiry so we can get to the bottom of all that happened on that terrible day in which this place was attacked. That might help a little bit. But we will have a hearing, which we hopefully will announce to you in the next week or so, where we could talk about everything.
Can I quickly respond, Mr. Chairman? Well, first of all, thank you for the hearing. And we look forward to that discussion, but with that, I would still press my
Okay,
hand.
and I appreciate it. And so the vote is on the Cole Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Be it chair, those have it.
On that, I'd request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
How is Mr. Neguse recorded?
Mr. Neguse is not recorded.
You're not recorded.
No.
Mr. Neguse, no.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Members not agreed to. Further amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee add to the rule a section providing for consideration of S 3541. This is the Healthcare for Burn Pit Veterans Act, and I would ask it to be under a closed rule. Mr. Chairman, S 3541 passed the Senate by unanimous consent on 16 February 2022, and it now awaits action here in the House. Mr. Chairman, my motion is simple. S 3541 is supported by a number of leading VSOs, including Disabled American Veterans, Veterans of Foreign Wars, Wounded Warrior Project, Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, the American Legion, and the Military Officers Association of America. This will not prevent the House from continuing its efforts to advance H.R. 3967 through the legislative process. Also importantly to note, this will allow the House to take swift and decisive action and pass a bill that could be signed into law by the end of the week. Now, I understand tomorrow is a State of the Union address, and we've got shortened time available for the floor, but I still believe that our time, I do not believe that our time is so limited that we can only consider one piece of legislation this week. If we have time, we should have the political will to do this. So let's adopt my motion, continue deliberating H.R. 3967, but pass S 3541 so we can provide our veterans with the care they deserve and have earned. So I urge adoption of my motion, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you, I appreciate it. And, I mean, I'm not even sure that the Veterans Committee in the House has even considered that bill. I mean, I'm not aware of, I mean, are you? I mean, have we done anything in the House on this?
Well, I would say we've considered a lot that has not gone through the typical.
I know how much you care about regular order, that's why I'm asking.
I'm just saying, there's a lot that we've
I know.
had in here that hasn't gone through order, but additionally, this passed the
Yeah.
UC in the Senate. I mean, this
Yeah,
is not
I-
a controversial bill.
Yeah, I just don't want to be accused of circumventing regular order here. So I would urge that that we vote no on this. And so the vote now is on the Reschenthaler amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the
No.
chair, noes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross, no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse, no. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
You can't see who? Mr. DeSaulnier, are you there? Did you hear him? Yeah, there he is, right there. Okay. Yeah, Mr. DeSaulnier, when you vote, can you vote again? Because we didn't see you when you voted.
I was so upset about the regular order discussion.
So, did you hear his vote? How did you vote? No?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier, no.
Okay.
Oh, I thought he meant no, I didn't vote no, but that's all.
Clerk will report the total. What?
4 yeas, 9 nays.
No, the members not agree to. Yeah, I'm also told that the amendment you just offered is in your substitute amendment. So I think we took care of that for you. I think we,
As always, Mr.
Yeah.
Chairman, you're nothing but generous.
yeah.
We could take it out.
Yeah. So anyway, all right, any other amendments? Hearing none, the vote is on the motion from the gentleman from California. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no?
No.
Being the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I request a
A
recording.
recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? Aye. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Aye. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier?
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Ms. Ross?
Aye.
Ms. Ross, aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse, aye. Mr. Cole?
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mrs. Fishbach? Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
The motion is agreed to, and I will handle it for the Democrats.
And Mr. Reschenthaler will handle it for the Republicans.
I'm going to look forward to it.
I'm sure you do, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. And that's it, right? Anything else? Nothing? Okay. Rules Committee is adjourned.
Yeah.
Like, it's not a vote, we can make law, we can make law with that Senate.